Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I almost forgot the show name. Jan, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. So my name's Jan Nisbet. I am a recently retired faculty member from the University of New Hampshire. When I was at the University of New Hampshire, I started an institute that was focused on people with disabilities. And we worked in the state, but as well as nationally, to advance inclusive practices for children and adults who had disabilities. I did that for about 22 years or 23 years. During that time, I was president of the board of TASH, which is really where I met Nancy. She was the executive director and I was chair of the board. And that was a national, international organization that advocated for inclusive practices and was very much focused on non-punitive, positive behavioral supports, community living, regular school attendance, regular preschool attendance. So I did that. And then after that, I became the senior vice provost for research at the University of New Hampshire. And what does that mean? It means that I was responsible for overseeing and advancing the entire research portfolio. So whether it be in the engineering or life sciences or in education and humanities, it was my job to make sure that the research mission was moving forward. I retired from that position and finished the book.
When it comes to the outcomes of positive encouragement or positive behavioral rewards instead of the types of things that have been used, such as like I've spoken with Nancy about what the center uses. Is if there's more evidence behind that, why do you think that's not being such a giant thing that's being implemented? Because I always like, this might be not really a tangent, but people that work in these institutions, if you look inside a lot of them, I'm sure there's good people in there, but there is I would say a pattern of people that have some kind of behavioral or I would say power issues when it comes to some of the staff. I don't know if you've seen that correlation at all, but I've seen kind of like, especially with some of those videos that I saw from the center. They know it's not helping this person. They know it's not this type of beneficial act. And it seems like it's just a power thing. And I bet you, if you looked in their past, you would probably find some areas where they didn't necessarily feel powerful.
Well, I think um, I I don't think that there's one easy sort of correlation. I think there are some people that end up in these types of settings that have had difficulties, but there was a very interesting piece of research early on. I would say it was in the maybe late 1970s, early 1980s, and it was conducted as a dissertation by a man whose name was Stephen Taylor, who became the director of the Center on Human Policy at Syracuse University. I taught there for 4 years before I came to UNH. And what he did is he actually became an employee of a state institution. And it was a qualitative piece of research. It was, he was a participant. And what he did is he observed over time people who came to work at the institution with the best of intentions to be, to be supportive, to be helpful. Now, remember, many people ended up working at institutions because they were conscientious objectors to the Vietnam War. So you had this really eclectic group of people. But what he documented with his research is that people, they're taught by the environment too. And that people who came in, using very positive methods over time became more domineering, more hostile, in some cases violent, because that's what was happening in the institution. So I think we talk about people with disabilities learning from their environment. People without disabilities learn from their environment.
Well, like with the book, for instance, did you just specifically write about the center, or did you try and find correlations with any other institutions or any other practices that have happened in the past to be able to kind of relate it to the actions that this one had, or was this one just new?
This one is exceptional, but the book, the book really tried to look at the evolution of this kind of punitive practice over, now 50 years. So it examines the professional literature, the development of the whole field of behavior modification, that was very scientific, empirical, non-value based, and looks at the development of these practices over time and how they contributed to the use of electric shock on people with disabilities. So this is not a book. I mean, I wasn't out conducting research per se, like I wasn't doing intervention research. What I was doing is I was conducting research, but it was really like a qualitative case study, like collecting documents, uh, trying to tell a coherent story about a subject, as you said in your introduction, that people just can't believe is happening, even, today or yesterday, that it's outside of people's understanding of how human beings should be treated.
Now, are these documents that you were looking through, are they like open to the public? Is this something that just like it just slipped under the radar? Maybe people aren't aware about it? Because, like I said, before even mentioning the center or anything like that, people would be like, that's a conspiracy. And it's like, it just wasn't in the public's eye. I think at the time of the release that I saw it was in 2021 when we were in prime lockdown and COVID was on everybody's mind. And then they had a UAP article that slipped in under there. But I caught the third one because, I can fit in that situation. I could be in that situation. I have ADHD, and as much as we look at it differently now, back when I was a kid, it was the same kind of measures. It was putting me in a locked room. It was thinking that I need to be sent to a private school. And my heart goes out to, those people that are in these real institutions and situations. Now, I'm not going to be the person that's going to somehow blow the whistle or get this vocal thing on CNN or anything, but I think it needs to be talked about by more common people, and more people need to look into these types of things. So I'm curious to the documents. Are they
So it's
open?
been, I mean, this story has been on CNN, it's been on NBC, it's been on CBS, it's been in the New York Times, it's been in Mother Jones, this story has been told. It's been on Oprah. Uh,
Oprah
and
covered it.
Oprah covered the story. And it, just not to digress, but in the Oprah story, it ended up being a screaming match between parents who had placed their children there, and people who were advocating for positive practices. And then it became confused with the use of electric shock for the purposes of, for people that have um, depression or other psychiatric disabilities. So people thought, well, people use electric shock for people who have drug resistant depression. What's wrong with that? And that's an entirely different area, right? This is the use of electric shock to induce pain. This is punitive. And so, it's very important that the journalists who cover this topic make it really clear it is not, the kind of electric shock, then that's got its own set of problems, but it's quite different. And so, this subject has been covered over and over and over again. And of course, I watched all the episodes, I've read all of those articles. But what I had that other people didn't have is that when people knew I was writing this book, I received boxes and boxes, smelly boxes often that I think came out of basements or garages that had documents in them, records from the center, letters, photographs. Sometimes I knew who the boxes came from. Sometimes I didn't.
Why is there so much
Um,
fear behind it?
well, if you read the book, you'll understand.
Okay, well, it's on its way.
So, you know, the litigation strategy that the center used has been extremely effective, and the legal team that has represented the center over time, they're extremely skilled. And they, so for example, there was a woman, she's named in the book, Marianne Millard, who had worked at the center, who gave public testimony in front of the State House in Massachusetts during a time when Massachusetts was trying to pass legislation to outlaw the use of these practices. She was served papers. The attorneys threatened to sue her for libel. And so anyone who came out and was vocal against the use of these practices, they were often, served papers and, lawsuits threatened. I mean, there was a woman, again, this is documented in the book, Ann Donnellan, professor. She had been at the University of Wisconsin, then ended up at San Diego, but she was, very vocal critic. And they threatened to go after her uh, certification. She was a PhD psychologist, and and it was irrational if you really step back. But again, they were very heavy-handed, the attorneys, and it worked. And many people were silenced, I would say. And when I would call families who had their children there and ask them if I could interview them, um, some of them had reached settlements with the center and couldn't because there was essentially a non-disclosure agreement. But other families who did not were very reluctant to talk to me. One, out of fear, and two, I think it's such a difficult decision for families to make, to place their children there, that I think they don't want to revisit it, and don't want to talk about it. So I really had to rely mainly on written work rather than interviews. Certainly, I conducted some interviews, but the majority of the documentation, and it's extensive, um, and I did that purposely to make sure that everything in the book could be backed up by documents. Um,
Who wrote the documents?
oh, some of them were letters, some of them are newspaper articles, some of them are evaluation reports that had been conducted by the state of New York or the state of Massachusetts, to determine how people were being treated at the center. So you name it. I mean, when you get the book, go through the document, um, the, the footnotes, because there's thousands of them.
When it comes to, because I understand like a PhD speaking out about this and then them threatening, like that's a career move right there. It's a very risky decision. But when it comes to families, it makes me question how tied in this center is with people that can keep this thing so silent for so long. Either you have places where the state doesn't want to talk about it because if that gets publicized all over the place that this has been going on, then they look bad. I have no clue, but it's
So
just.
imagine this. So the state of New York at one point in the 1980s tried to pull all of the students from New York who were attending the center back to New York. And they were going to create a new program that would focus on students who had been labeled as having severe behavior disorders. A couple of parents sued the state and argued that this was the most effective program for their children, and that a judge was sympathetic to that argument, and the families would share often horrendous stories. And just, remember, so you go back to your experience having ADHD, being in school, being put into a room being in timeout. So many of these individuals, these people with disabilities, had received had similar experiences that you did, but worse. And the people that were trying to teach them, support them, either weren't skilled, didn't have the kind of support they needed. And so people's behavior accelerated, and some people became self abusive, aggressive. And so the parents throw up their arms and say, "What? I can't do this anymore." And they look at, oh, the state institution with thousands of people, horrendous conditions, or this private school in Massachusetts that professes to get their children off drugs and medications and uses procedures that will stop these behaviors. And remember, punishment works. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but punishment by definition is the use of something that stops a problematic behavior. The problem is you have to keep punishing.
Well, the problem is, what do you label problematic behavior? Blowing a kiss to someone is not problematic behavior.
Correct. Correct. So I'm using an extreme example with you,
Yeah.
you know, and I'm trying to reference how people ended up there, and the families suing the state, the judge saying, hey, nothing else has worked. This place has documentation. They have, essentially poster children, people who have come into the center who are highly self-abusive, and all of a sudden they're not, right? And they're being punished, and the punishment has to increase rather than decrease for it to be effective over time, which is how the electric shock devices got developed. So they started out at using a certain, level of electric shock, amperage, and over time people would adjust to it. And then they'd have to use more electric shock. And then they had to develop a new device that had more electric shock in order to control people's behavior.
I know you've seen the Andrew McCollins video, but I watched it and I posted it with Nancy's episode when I put it up on Twitter. And I had friends message me refusing to watch it because they have kids and they can't handle something like that. And I'm like, I just feel like there's an area where we don't have not only an understanding what's going on at these institutions, but there's a giant misunderstanding when it comes to developmental disabilities as well too. I feel like a lot more people would be involved and less likely. And I get it as a parent, if it's stressful to have a kid that's punching you and hitting you and you can't do anything to stop it, it might just be easier to send them away. I understand that. I really do. But I also think that this is a big fault on our education as the public. We do not understand the full scope of these disabilities. We look at it like, well, they're the experts. Well, how do you know that they're the experts? That person probably just got a job there. I had a buddy reach out to me. He was on the show before and he gave me an experience. He told me I could mention it again because he caught Nancy's episode and he could relate. His brother is developmentally disabled and they brought him to an institution. And the only way they found out that he was being abused at this institution was he has these moments where they would FaceTime him. They'd have an hour of FaceTime and he would just put the like think he minimized it or closed it, and he didn't. So my buddy's mom goes, "Oh, he doesn't know that we're still here. So I'm gonna take a picture of him. His hair looks so nice." And you hear a door bust open in the background, and then someone come in and call him a retard and push him up against the wall by his throat. And she caught it all on video. They got on news here locally. It was a couple of years ago. But these are things that happen at these institutions, and without evidence, you don't. There's not proof. You can't just go by hearsay.
Right. No, I mean, and the parents who have had children there, report that, their children are shocked for ignoring somebody. They're shocked for not putting on their coat. It's not that, you know, it's not like they're being shocked for the most serious behaviors ever. I mean, they're being shocked for routine behaviors that somebody considers, as you point out, problematic. So if we go back in time and you think about, you know, the community services have really evolved over time, right? So there was a time you had a kid with a disability, send them to the institution. right? Then the whole deinstitutionalization movement, the development of community services, the a better understanding of, as you say, people with developmental disabilities. If you take autism as an example, when I was coming up through my educational training, we knew very little about autism. And, we had no real understanding, of the communication issues, for example. And now there's a whole movement, to help support, non-speaking people so they can communicate their needs rather than having to act out their needs, rather than to get frustrated. And so we made all these assumptions that people weren't smart, couldn't understand what was going on, couldn't learn. And imagine being that person where you don't have a communication system. People don't think that you're competent and you begin to act out. And so now we know so much more that we don't have, the people that are going to the Judge Rotenberg Center now, they're not the people with autism spectrum disorders and the kind of people with developmental disabilities, that were placed there back in the 70s, 80s. They're coming from New York, huge population, New Jersey, and many of them are getting there through the court system. They're not getting there through, the education system or the developmental disability system. They may have ADHD, they may have a learning disability, but they have gotten in trouble.
Well,
And
the
this is being used as a diversion program for them.
Well, the thing about ADHD is it might have changed from not being labeled as a mental disability as severe as autism, but it is considered still a problematic mental disorder when it comes to learning experiences, when it comes to other things as well too. I know it's been from people that I've talked to who's researched it and my own personal experience. It's just more stigmatized to be able to be like, oh, that's a punishment person or that's a punishment kid. For instance, I always got thrown out of class. It's not I was doing anything bad. It's just being able to sit still for a little bit amount of time. I got lumped into a class where I would sit with people who were smoking cigarettes in class, and I wasn't supposed to be there, and the teachers knew that, but they would let me, read a magazine or something to get through class because I wasn't supposed to be in that, what they would call in-school suspension. Now, are they changing this center in that aspect of making it like a detention center, like something with kids that what we call troubled youth, which is such a weird word to say?
They've had a history of having, people who are labeled developmentally disabled and sort of people who are labeled troubled. So this isn't a brand new practice, but over time, the balance of the population seems to be going in the direction of the troubled youth, um, more than, people who have uh, developmental disabilities and been labeled as having behavior disorders.
Is there a reason for that? Is it just because the number of people from New York, or is there just because it seems like it would be a lot harder to get an institution shut down if you start saying it's a bunch of troubled youth kids there. But if you say developmental disability people, then it's easier for people to get more attention on that. But if you just have a school of bad kids, it's the same reason with like prisons. When you say prisons, nobody really has a heart for a prisoner unless you know one.
Hmm. Well, um, so it's an I mean, it's a comp that's a
Complicated
comp
question.
it's a complicated question. So I'm not saying there aren't people with developmental disabilities there. I'm just saying that over time the
Yeah.
population has changed. Now, why does New York send so many people there? Well, the Judge Rotenberg Center has relationships with attorneys in the city. They are doing very active recruitment, and are very focused on that particular population. So New York, New Jersey. I'm not saying there aren't individuals from other states. There certainly are, but not the quantity as from New York.
Now, what's this guy's background who runs this institution? Has he just been on like this weird kind of ivory tower path or something? He feels like he's superior. Like what's how
Well,
do you
he's no longer the director. He had to step down.
okay.
So after, one of the incidents where
2013, right?
this was the incident where the student called in and acted as a staff member and instructed the staff to shock two individuals multiple times, even though they hadn't done anything.
Yeah.
And it was on video. The director of the center, Matthew Israel, destroyed those videotapes after the incident. And as a result, he stepped down and moved to California, and his assistant director took over. He PhD from Harvard, studied with B.F. Skinner, law degree from Harvard. He out of college, he wanted to start a commune that was very much, you know, uh, an outgrowth of Walden II, Skinner's book. And he did that for a couple years, and then he started working with autistic kids in Rhode Island and started using these behavioral methods on a group of kids who were at least labeled autistic or had problematic behaviors. And from there, the state of Rhode Island actually pulled all their kids out of the program after they took a look at it. And then he based the program in Massachusetts, in Canton, Massachusetts. And then he grew it from there.
What's the lasting effects from some of these treatments that parents are dealing with now with their kids who went to this institution and got this level of treatment? Because if you're talking about shocking kids whenever they deem a problematic behavior arises, blowing a kiss or doing something that doesn't fit the rules and regulations of whatever they want, I start wondering, you start to decipher maybe at that level, what's right and wrong. And now you don't know because you've been like, is drinking a glass of water wrong? Well, I don't want to get shocked, so I'm going to leave it there. There's
So there haven't been follow-up studies, of the people that have left the center. Um, but people who have left the center, talk about the trauma, and the book starts actually with a letter by Jennifer Musumba, who was at the Rotenberg Center, who finally left. And she provided testimony to the Food and Drug Administration during the period of time that they were considering a ban on the use of these devices. And it's chilling. I can't even describe how chilling this letter is. And it helps. And she talks about what happened to her as a result of this kind of intervention. So there haven't been long-term follow-up studies, but people again who have come out, have discussed and talked to Nancy personally about the impact of these kinds of treatments. There's a great quote. I think it's a great quote that I used in the book. Uh, by a psychologist whose name was E.M. Opton, who criticized kind of the use of these behavioral techniques on people with institutions. Can I just read it to you? It's pretty
yeah,
short.
yeah.
Recent years have witnessed increasing use of the medical metaphor. The language of behavior modification is ideally suited to this defensive operation, for it is abstract enough to include yet disguise any exertion of institutional power through reward and punishment. The language is useful in distracting the public, the legislature, the judiciary, and perhaps occasionally the inmates. But most of all, the language of behavior modification is marvelously suited to soothe the conscience of institutional administrators.
It's literally what I mentioned in the beginning about the power thing, about the people that work at these institutions. I'm not saying they're all bad. I don't think that at all. But I mean, it's the language that we use as well too. If I told you right now chopping off my hand and I call it weight loss surgery, is it though? Like, I mean, just it's the same thing. It's just when you put behavioral modification therapy or anything of that sort of technical term on something and someone's not going to look into it, more times than not, the general public is just going to read it as, oh, they're probably talking about like mood therapy or some type of
Right,
thing.
exactly.
It's not the same thing. Electroconvulsive therapy is different than this from what I learned. I knew
ECT,
shocks, yes,
right.
but now ECT is beneficial for schizophrenia and other things as well too. But when we look at things of like what this device did is not the same. It's not the type that it was implemented either. It was implemented over things where if you're reading it, just groaning at getting a shock, fidgeting when you're getting a shock. I would do that. Any person would do that. It's a reactionary thing. And you start realizing that this isn't seen as like helping anybody. This is actually a form of treatment where someone just really gets off on that power aspect of being able to hurt somebody.
Hmm. And I'm just going to follow up that quote with, I think, a contrasting perspective by a man whose name was Herb Lovett. I don't know if you've heard this name before, um, but he was a psychologist, Harvard trained too, but he wrote this very famous book called Learning to Listen. And it was very much about meeting people where they were and not treating them like some object, of behavior modification. So he wrote that one of the most important lessons of behavioral thinking is the power of environments to teach. Hurting people to control their behavior necessarily takes place in highly authoritarian settings. How often do our human services ask the simple human question, how can we help this person live where she is loved and have access to the people and things she herself loves? Instead, we generally demand that people demonstrate ordinary behavior as a prerequisite, not for a life that looks to their satisfaction and happiness, but for the simple absence of pain. This irrationality defies all logic, and an era of logic and rationality is fatal to behaviorism, which has been aggressively anti emotional and overly dependent on empiricism. The use of pain betrays its own bedrock perception. If the environment is the great teacher and people are given violent environments, how in the world can they be expected not to be aggressive and self injurious? The use of pain to control people has become both morally and intellectually bankrupt.
Mm. We mentioned something earlier about the positive behavior aspects of some of the research that you've done. When it comes to the positive things, what are some better measures that could be set in place? Because I'm hoping this book, when it catches a lot of people's attention, that we can find ways to maybe implement new strategies. Now, that's obviously knowing that some institutions aren't going to go by those strategies. We know people that break the law all the time. But if we can set an overall measure in place where we're able to look at this differently than just using something that is an authoritative strategy to be able to fix a problem that I feel like we don't even understand. Um, Positive behavior. I know what really warmed my heart was when I saw my school dealing with ADHD differently, especially with my nephews and things, was meditation time. Now I'm glad I skipped out on that just because I can't do meditation, but it's a new perspective. It's something new. And I go, all right, well, it's leaking over here. How do we get it to access all other aspects of what we would consider a disorder or a disability? So I'm curious to are some of the positive behavior things.
Well, I mean, the fundamental practice behind positive behavior intervention and supports, um, people are now using use language around trauma informed care and supports, is to try to understand one. I mean, there's the environmental piece, which is you don't segregate people, you don't put people who have similar issues in the same environment because they learn from each other, right? You want to have positive role models, you want to have inclusive environments, you want people to have the support they need to be in those environments. And then you don't want to use punishment. Rather, you want to be able to manipulate the environment. So you said meditation. One thing that I know one school used is there was somebody who, had some labels of behavior problems, and they instituted, with a lot of other kids, um, a exercise program first thing in the morning that included running. So it wasn't like gym. It was much more, this people could sign up for it, and that alone had an incredible impact on decreasing the problematic behavior because there was some energy involved, but it also created a community. And then the kind of supports that people need to learn and high expectations. So I think that's the other piece that's really important, is that you want to assume that everybody can learn, and you want to give them the kind of supports and instruction, adaptations, augmentative communication that they need to demonstrate who they are, what their preferences are, what they need to communicate, what they're learning. And so it's a whole different approach than, if you do this, I'm going to do that. If you don't behave, I'm going to do that, without asking the question, which is, what's going on? Why is this person acting like this? What's going on at home? Is the schedule such? There's a group, George Sagai, Rob Horner, who kind of promoted positive behavior supports and really looked at it as a systems issue. So you couldn't just look at an individual. You had to look at the classroom. You had to look at the school. You had to look at the entire community environment. And, one example is that they learned that there was a lot of acting out during periods of high density student movement in the school, in the hallways, on the way to lunch, in between periods. People, whether it was stress or the opportunity, and they changed schedules. They simply modified schedules and how many people could be in the hallways. And that didn't do anything for the individual, but that alone had an overall decrease in problematic, So again, the approach is not, this is an individual, I'm going to control your behavior. The approach is, this is a systems issue. And we're going to look at this as a systems issue, and we're going to try to figure out what's going on. And we're going to provide that individual with the kind of supports and services that person needs to be successful.
Now,
And that's a different approach.
did the documents that you read that caused you to write this book, did that make you think this way or care more about the education system a little bit? Because I'll admit, for myself, I had the issues with the education system. I never blamed the people. I blamed just the amount of, like, just getting away with a problem for the longest time was just pushing it somewhere you can't see it. So that was an easy thing to put me in a room by myself rather than try and sit there and talk to me and hash out what the issues are or whatever problem we need to fix is. I'm just curious, if through the documents that you've read, did you find something that was, that caused your interest to look in other areas of the education system? And because the way you're describing a lot of like the positive behavioral stuff, you're talking about a lot of issues that are common stuff today that we have, not like shock therapy. I'm talking about just issues with understanding what a kid needs in a sense too. And I see that a lot now. I see a lot more teachers now that are taking that individual time to understand their students a little bit more. And I think that's going to end up changing information later down the road, not just so we're not having some old style methods, I would say, still in place.
Well, I guess what I would say is that this book didn't sort of teach me to have a better understanding of positive practices and inclusive edge. I'd been working in the field for a long time before I started writing this book. I had done a lot of deinstitutionalization work, both on the legal side as well as in practice. So I had been in schools, I had been in work environments, I had been in community settings where many of these practices were being used. And then the institute I ran had programs for schools, had programs for teachers, had programs for university students to teach them, inclusive practice, positive behavior supports, augmentative communication strategies, assistive devices, and technology that could help people learn. So I came into writing this book with that overall understanding and knowledge. Did this book help reinforce it? Yes.
Mhm.
Did I
Well, it had me think about troubled youth a little bit differently, I guess, is the question. Because if you would have said it's a troubled kid or something like that, I'd be like, okay, so he did something bad, he gets punished, right? But then you start looking and understanding what this book is about, and it's like, what are we classifying troubled youth? What are we classifying as a punishment? You kind of start looking at like it's the technical terms.
Yeah, well, and I think that's, it's the language, right? If you say to somebody, this is an intervention, people think, oh, that's an intervention.
I must
This
have a
is a
problem.
treat. This is a treatment. Oh, that's a treatment. If you say this is abuse, it's exactly the same thing, but you've labeled it something different. And then people pay attention, right? Abuse, but it's been reframed as intervention. Electric shock for, in this book, the use of the GED, the self-injurious behavior inhibiting system, which was the precursor system of applying electric shock. It wasn't described as abuse. It was described as intervention and treatment. And that compelled judges who were ruling on these matters to allow them to occur.
Did what are the other methods besides the shock that was being introduced at this facility, or maybe one that they used in the past?
Food deprivation.
Okay, yeah, the food deprivation. I know. I think Nancy mentioned that one too. Yeah.
There was a vapor spray helmet that used ammonia that would spray into the face of an individual, slapping individuals with spatulas. I mean, I that those techniques went kind of to the wayside after the development of the self-injurious behavior inhibiting system, which was electric shock. But I actually, if I can find it, I will. Let's see.
I know a lot of it's got because the kid that called a prank call in, and these people shocked these kids who didn't do anything wrong. I start to wonder, like, as a person administering that, do you just feel like you're following what you're supposed to do? Or do you ever question your own actions on some things? Because I think there's a line for everybody. I just hope that line isn't too far.
Um,
It's hard to answer that because it's like you got to put yourself in that person's perspective, understand their like life a
yeah,
little bit. But
but I think they come in and this is what they're told to do. And, if they haven't had what I would call good training, they haven't been through university programs that help people sort of adopt positive practices, that teach them, how to help people in a more less coercive way. And so they might be coming out with a degree in psychology. And I'm not saying that a bachelor's degree in psychology is a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have any educational or clinical experience with people. You could have gotten a bachelor's degree in psychology and been in an experimental program that was doing animal research. Matthew Israel, who started this center, was not a clinical psychologist. He had a PhD in experimental psychology. He was working on rats and pigeons. He did not come out of a degree program like is required today to have, to be licensed. His license was grandfathered in the state of Massachusetts.
hmm.
And so he did not have to have the requisite experience that's required today for somebody to have a clinical psychology degree.
You mentioned other institutions. Are there similar ones besides this one that um has, I guess, been on my mind for the past couple of weeks now? Once I've kind of dived back into the topic of it, besides mentioning it and someone calling me a conspiracy theory person. Is there other institutions? I know there's got to be some out there that we probably don't know about, but have you came across any that use maybe some similar methods of abuse?
I am not aware of any other institution or center that uses electric shock as punishment on people with disabilities.
Is more of it just like punishment as in taking away something? This is the
Yeah.
first one.
So,
Okay.
I mean, if you have you spent any time in residential institutions?
No.
I mean, you might say by their very nature they're punitive, right? You take away
I've went
people's
to
oppor-.
one and all the furniture was really extremely heavy, like it was nailed to the floor.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, a lot of institutions have closed, but people don't have, peers, don't have non-disabled peers. They don't have, the same kind of educational opportunities. They're educated in separate classrooms. They're not necessarily being taught things that are, you know, interesting. Not being taught how to be self-sufficient and be able to be in a workplace that you and I might be in. So, are there other places in the United States, separate schools and institutions that use punitive techniques? Absolutely. Are they using electric shock? Not to my knowledge.
And when it comes to like the lack of knowledge, for instance, that maybe that what we would call maybe lack of teaching at some of these institutions, is that a great way just to keep them sucked back in, saying they need more time here or something of that sort?
Well, I mean, if you go back to that quote about environments being teachers, um, the longer somebody stays in an institution, the longer they're taught institutionalized behavior. I mean, I did some expert witness work um, for the state of Connecticut when they were closing their state institution. And I would go in and observe people and take notes. What was happening? There was a man who was laying in a bed all by himself in a room on a mattress uh, with a sheet over him. Over 3 days, I never saw him leave the bed. I'm like, what? He was on a lot of medication. I'm like, what is going on? Well, that's what he likes to do. Really? Is that okay? Well, he just refuses to do anything else. So what's he learning? He's learning lay in bed with a sheet over your head and don't do anything. And if anyone tries to make you do anything or have you do anything, you resist because the environment is so problematic. I'm going to tell you one more story that I think emphasizes this. So, in probably the late 1980s, I was asked to take to weigh in on a woman who was at the state psychiatric facility of New Hampshire, and it was a it was a legal case where the there was a case the woman that had brought against the state for lack of an appropriate placement in the least restrictive environment. So I was brought in, I spent time with her, I talked to people. She she had stopped taking care of herself. She could barely dress herself. She was missing her teeth. She was on major psychiatric meds and had developed tics as a result of it. She would not sleep on a regular bed. She would only sleep on the floor in the mattress, and she was totally blind. So I'm like, and so they were saying, like, where could she live? What kind of life could she have? And I said, well, she could have a much better life than this. She could live in her own place with some supports. She could learn to navigate. Well, it turns out that this woman, this is the idea of understanding where people came from. This woman had been married, had two kids, and had begun to develop loss of vision. So she went to the best medical centers in New England, and they diagnosed her with these syndromes, and over time, she totally lost her vision. They called it a psychiatric problem. And as she lost her vision, she became anxious. Again, married, 2 kids. She gets placed because of her anxiety into the state institution. While at the state institution, she's now blind. She gets raped by another person who's living in the facility. She then becomes aggressive when anyone tries to approach her when she's sleeping. And she began to bite people. So they removed her teeth so that she wouldn't bite people. And then she became aggressive, so they put her on antipsychotic medication. Do you know why she lost her vision? Because she was on birth control pills that were too strong at the time. That was the origin of her blindness and her anxiety. And yet she got diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder and ended up in an institution, barely able to take care of herself and over-medicated. Eventually she got out and had a different life. Huh?
Did her vision come back?
No, she had lost her vision. But anyway, we talk about understanding, trying to understand where people come from, and, the power of environments, and what happens when people are living in environments that have violence associated with them. I just think I still think about this woman.
It sounds like a horror movie. It's just, I think, especially when we talk about environments, there's something impactful about living in a positive space. And it is that a positive encouragement. And I get a lot of times it's hard when you need something to be done, and maybe some person feels like they got to do this type of extreme measure to get whatever they need done. But patience, I mean, it is something like I would never work at one of these institutions. I just don't have the patience for it. I don't have the capacity. I give any person who has a child with a developmental disability, they have all my respect in the world, because I know how difficult it can be. But also, when we talk about the individual time that a person needs, whether they have a disability or not, I mean, I think this is something that's starting to kind of do a little bit of a turnaround, at least in mostly the public education systems. I'm just hoping we can get more exposure on these institutions, like the one that you wrote a book about and the one that Nancy has talked about on the show as well too, just so people are more aware. I get it, got an Oprah spot, and maybe it's people's lack of education of developmental disabilities, or what we're calling the technical terms and language that's being used. But it's something that it needs to be thoroughly investigated. We need attention on that as well too. I'm a big advocate now. I mean, it's heartbreaking. You hear the amount of stories that people experience, and you can't think it to be real, but it does, and it happens more often than you think.
It does, and it does, and yet Massachusetts had tried twice to decertify the Judge Rotenberg Center, and they lost both times. And both commissioners of developmental disability services and mental health had to leave their jobs as a result. So here are people who, they have external evaluations of the center, they bring people in, they document, the problems associated with this, and yet they end up losing their jobs because they are accused by the Rotenberg Center, the Behavior Research Institute, that was its name previously, and the attorneys as being biased, as trying to get them. And the judge bought it.
How do you get someone that's not biased? And why are they going to the same judge every time? Can they pick a new judge?
Well, so that's again, the name of the Judge Rotenberg Center is named after the judge that kept the center open. And he's the one that made the decisions, made the decision in both of those cases. No, in the first case with Mary Kay Leonard, and then a different judge made a decision in Philip Campbell was the commissioner at the time. But there's an interesting there's an interesting, again, quote in the book that I'm just going to read because I know we're coming to the end
Yep.
of our time. And so this was written by a woman who was part of a team that went in to evaluate the individuals who were at the Rotenberg Center, and the state of Massachusetts was conducting a review. So the attorneys were alleging that this team was biased, and therefore they couldn't do a review. Right? They were biased against the use of electric shock. And so she writes, it is interesting that virtually every major professional association in the country has made a position statement against the use of painful and degrading aversive methods. Note that most of these statements are not against the use of all aversive methods, but rather those that cause pain, physical damage, and degradation. Many of BRI's charges against people on the Rivendell team, that's the evaluation team I was talking about, are that they belong to professional associations which have taken positions against the use of aversive therapies. That gives them a basis for alleging bias against almost any professional in the country. But that was the legal strategy.
It really, like, I just want to go. I want to meet these people. I want to be like, do you smell sulfur? Like, you gotta sniff them. This is ridiculous, and it doesn't seem right. I know it's not right, but it's just the way that it angers me because you're getting away with something so horrible. And I get it. It's the best legal strategy is putting it into terms that nobody's really going to look into. When I won a court case over a medication, they put it in such legal terms. I didn't know if I won. I was like, did I win? Like, it was just so technical. It didn't make sense. And I mean, is it something you can take to the Supreme Court? Is it something that you can take to a higher institution or something? That might sound ridiculous, but it's something that if it's went twice and you're having it get denied every single time and it's not being shut down. I know it was temporary closed, but I guess that was just because of the pandemic. They're still open now, aren't they?
Oh yeah, they never closed.
Oh God.
They never closed. They're still open. But they were allowed, I don't know, did the FDA, banned the use of electric shock, and then the Rotenberg Center brought a case against the FDA and won in the U.S. Court of Appeals.
They beat the FDA.
So
how do you beat the FDA? Oh my God.
Mm-hmm. So 3 judges, U.S. Court of Appeals, D.C. Circuit, and they argued that the FDA had overstepped its authority and that they were practicing medicine. So that was one part of the decision. So 2 of the judges ruled to overturn the FDA decision. And the other was that you can't ban electrical shock for a single population. So the ban was the use of aversive electric shock on people with developmental disabilities. And they argued that if you're going to ban electric shock, you have to ban it for everybody. And there's all these technologies, I don't know, not severe electric shock, but, for cigarette smoking, for bedwetting, for, whatever. And so the ban was overturned, and now we don't, I don't know what the strategy is. If there is a strategy, if they're going to go back in. I talked to a woman the other day who said, well, why couldn't they just ban electric shock over a certain amperage for everybody? So I'm not sure what their next steps are, but obviously Nancy and I are paying attention.
Well, I'm supporting you guys. I really hope you guys get some big moves happening. Everyone, please, I can't recommend the book enough. I'm excited to read it. So I haven't read it, so I don't know the full scope. I could give you a full breakdown. I'm excited to have you both on as well, too, to be able to discuss after I've read it. Is there a place that people can find any of your links? Do you have a Twitter? Do you have any social media or a website?
So there is, yep. So uh, there is a Facebook page, Pain and Shock in America. The name of the book is Pain and Shock in America: Politics, Advocacy, and the Controversial Treatment of People with Disabilities. So there's information there with links about how to buy the book. You can buy the book on Amazon, and you can buy the book through Brandeis University Press.
I will link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.